Hey guys, welcome to our lesson on ground ambulance operations. We know that ground ambulance operation is an extremely common aspect of EMS. We know that all of our patients generally are going to get transported by ground, other than unless it's a circumstance where, for example, we need air transport or specialized care transport. There's a lot of important things that we have to recognize as we go through this lesson, including standards for operation, safety components, emergency vehicle operation, and then maintenance and regular routine supportive care of your equipment and your transporting vehicle. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we have to recognize is that there are standards for ambulances. Oversight for EMS usually falls under state government. That is the case here in Michigan. And then requirements for ambulance services are typically written into statutes, state statutes or laws or regulations. And that is, again, the case for Michigan. There are also national standards and trends that have an influence on the development of laws, but there's not necessarily a direct correlation between those national standards and what states decide to adopt as far as legislation or regulation. State laws are very broad. They provide a lot of oversight, but without really any specifics in regards to that. State standards tend to be pretty generic. They're more palatable, typically more affordable, more politically feasible for EMS agencies throughout the state. You have to remember that the state has to set the bar for the lowest common denominator, not necessarily where the golden standard should be. Now, we know that with states, again, setting these minimum standards, we talked about that just a second ago, rather than going for the gold standards, it's your local operations, your local services that determine how they want to approach that state standard. Do they want to shoot just for the minimum, or do they want to shoot more for that golden standard? Take a look at around the Battle Creek area. You can easily decide for yourself which services meet the minimum standards, which reach for gold standards, and which ones fall in between. As far as ambulance design goes, the U.S. General Services Administration Automotive Commodity Center, right, the long name, they're the ones that issue federal regulations in regards to specifics for manufacturing of ambulances and designing of ambulances as well. They set the basic requirements as far as what safety standards are. These specifications fall from the Department of Transportation K 1822F specs, which again are going to have the basic influence as far as what standards and what cosmetic looks must an ambulance have. Let's talk about the different types of ambulance that we see in regards to design. There are three primary types that we see. There are other ones when we think about ambulance design and duty, heavy duty versus medium duty, things of that nature. But your typical three types of ambulance include the conventional ambulance, where you have a truck cab chassis with some type of modular ambulance body. A type 2, which is going to be the standard van with forward control, and it has a one solid piece integral cab body system. We would typically refer to those, as I do at least, as far as a van ambulance. And the third one is some type of specialty van with forward control, and again with an integrated cab body ambulance. We also know that as far as design goes, there are medium-duty ambulances typically used for rescue vehicles. These ambulances are designed to handle a much heavier load as far as the amount of equipment that they can typically hold. Normally has a gross weight of about to 24,000 pounds, which is a pretty good-sized truck. Again, federal specifications provide a lot of guidelines for states to follow, but often states use federal specifications as a basis for their own regulations. Again, where they're going to decide to set that minimum bar. We also know that when we're dealing with ambulance design, there's been a lot of push in the recent decades to improve the safety of ground ambulances. In addition, the Department of Transportation, or DOT, along with other federal agencies and national organizations, have influenced standards. That includes both the design and the way that these ambulances function in more of a safety aspect. Things like having crosshatch designs on the back of the ambulance with reflective requirements, that there are safety restraints inside for not only the patient but also the primary care provider. Now, most of the time when we're thinking about ambulance operation, we think about driving the ambulance, but there's more to it than just that. We have medical equipment standards that have to be in place and maintained in order for patient care to be optimized. OSHA is one of the big folks that have to do with that, along with NIOSHA and MyOSHA. A lot of OSHAs. OSHA's helped ensure that the use of equipment lists calling for disinfecting agents, specifics for sharp containers, red bags, biohazard bags, specific types of N95 or HEPA masks, and then all the personal protective equipment you need to be safe while transporting a patient, regardless of from where you're going, more along the lines that your personal safety is considered in the back of that truck, beyond the safety specs for the vehicle itself. NIOSH has again established safety standards that are very similar in nature. Most of the time when we're thinking about medical equipment, these standards are referenced in local ordinances and they become standards for a given municipality. So for example, Life Care, Marshall, JCA, LCA, Pride Care, Life EMS, they may all have their own local ordinances or standards for their organization. We also know that that's going to be based on medical control authority region. What does the county or the region have to say in regards to what equipment is necessary on an ALS or BLS or limited life support ambulance? Now, that medical direction boards, or the MCA board itself, will also have an overview of medications that the paramedic may carry. Again, that's going to be more specific for advanced life support equipment, and they're going to outline what the minimum is from the state, right? And then also what the local municipality or the local medical control authority wants you to carry. For example, epinephrine pens, epi auto-injectors. That's not a common practice for medical first responders in the state. However, local med controls can provide oversight and authority for them to practice with certain medications. Common ones you see with MFRs are Narcan, Epi, you may see glucagon, and a multitude of other ones that I can't come to mind right now. There are additional guidelines at a national level. We have the Commission on Accreditation for Ambulance Services, or what we refer to as CAS accreditation, which provides a voluntary set of standards which they consider to be the gold standards for EMS communities to follow. It's going to require onboarding of medical equipment and supplies that both comply with state and local guidelines, as well as superseding those standards to, again, establish that gold standard. Remember that accreditation means credible services, credible standards. Now, when you're checking your ambulance, we have to recognize that one of your aspects as a paramedic that oftentimes get pushed to the back burner is how important it is that you have all of your necessary equipment. Not only do you have the intelligence and the critical thinking and the raw skills to provide emergency care, you also have the equipment. A paramedic's not a paramedic without an ambulance. So it's essential that a paramedic's duties include completion of an ambulance equipment and supply checklist every single time you're on shift. It's important that you ensure all equipment and supplies are available and in working order, and that you ensure both the equipment on the truck along with the mechanical aspects of the vehicle, including things like checking the oil, windshield wiper fluid, coolant, proper working emergency lights, personal protective equipment for yourself, all those things are in good working order as well. We want to make sure that patient infection control, comfort, and protection supplies are good to go, that we have an initial and focused assessment equipment for us to be able to perform our assessment. Either that may be carried on the individual person or in a first-in bag. We need to make sure we have equipment for when we transfer patients over to the hospital. We need to make sure that we have equipment for airway maintenance and ventilation and resuscitation. We don't want to have to think about that equipment when we're trying to perform emergency skills. And then, do we have enough oxygen? Is our suction working? Is there proper mechanical suction that goes along with that? We also need to make sure that we have equipment that's in good working order for cardiac resuscitation. That includes your cardiac monitor. Make sure you're performing a daily self-test of the defibrillator. Making sure that your batteries are fully charged. You have adequate electrodes and pads that are non-expired. Pediatric equipment. We also need to make sure that we've got trauma gear. Things as far as bandaging and bleeding control supplies and equipment for immobilizing suspected bone injuries or fractures. We also need to make sure, again, like we mentioned earlier, wound care and treatment of shock. That includes things like blankets and towels and general linen, which is important, pillows, things that we oftentimes forget about as part of our ambulance checklist. And then supplies for things like childbirth. That goes right back to making sure you have appropriate OB kits, that you have enough of them, because oftentimes you go in for one baby and 2 or 3 may come out. And then, again, you have the linen that's necessary to support drying, warming, and stimulating that child. The supplies, equipment, and medications for treating things like poisoning, snake bites, chemical burns, diabetic emergencies are a lot more specific when it comes to that gear. So we want to make sure we have the appropriate things based on our local standards. Again, general ALS equipment, medications, making sure they're not expired, IV admin components, needles, stopcocks, things that we're generally going to need to function as a paramedic on an ambulance. We want to make sure we have safety equipment, include things like fire extinguishers or some type of strobes or electronic like flares. And then do we have information for operations? Do we have map books? And do we have other components that we need to have working computer or PCR documentation? All of that. And then make sure you inspect the outside of your ambulance as well. You are a driving billboard. The last thing you want to do is not look professional in the public's eyes. Again, remember that routine checking helps minimize issues of risk or error. Last thing you want to do is have to worry about having a piece of equipment or trying to troubleshoot a piece of equipment on scene. It's just going to make your day a lot harder, so let's do that early before you get your first call. Medications. You need to know what drugs are in your drug box and that those medications are in good working order. They're all there and they're non-expired. Again, that should be checked each shift. Generally, we focus primarily on things like narcotics, but you got to remember that includes things like oxygen. Do you have portable oxygen tanks? Do you have a main oxygen tank that's full? And then again, make sure your ambulance is always checked and always in good working order. When you're checking your ambulance, again, make sure it's disinfected before you start, and then again after each call, right? Remember that cleaning is also part of that ambulance checklist, along with disinfecting, even though we may not think it is. Ask yourself, if you are transporting a patient who is immunocompromised, would they be exposed to some type of pathogen in your ambulance? The other question I would ask you is, when was the last time your ambulance was cleaned and disinfected appropriately? Take a white towel and start to wipe down some surfaces, things commonly touched areas, handrails, cabinet door latches, the cot itself. See what comes out in that white towel. You'll be real surprised that generally they're not as clean as we think they are or what they appear to be. And then make sure that we do all scheduled tests, maintenance, and calibration on medical equipment regularly so that, again, our ambulance is in good working order. Common pieces of equipment you might have, there's quite a few things, but things like an AED, glucometer, cardiac monitor, capnograph, or different attachments for capnography, oxygen systems that we've got, maybe your ATV, your automatic transport ventilator, supply tubing that goes with that ventilator tube, HEPA filters, those components, pulse oximetry. We have enough of those. We have pediatric pulse oximetry devices we can use. Do we have things like suction units, spare suction tubing and canisters? Is our wall unit and our portable suction good to go? Is our laryngoscope blades white, tight, and bright? Are they fiber optic and maybe there's a crack in the line which is going to prevent us from being able to visualize the glottic opening upon oral tracheal intubation? Do we have lighted stylets? Do we have enough endotracheal tubes and regular airway management components? Pen lights? Some of us carry that on our person, but if you don't, does your ambulance have one and is it working? Last thing you want to do is have to shine a giant flashlight in their eyes, which was not a good idea, or to have your partner turn on and turn off the module to the ambulance so you can turn the lights on and off in the back to check pupils. And then anything that's battery operated, check to make sure the batteries are good, replace them if it's necessary, and make sure that you have spares in case of an issue. So let's switch gears a little bit and let's start to talk about staffing and deployment. This is a really important aspect in current EMS today because there is a drastic shortage of EMS providers, meaning there's less personnel, which means there's less trucks available to take calls. Deployment depends on which organization you're working in. Every system is a little bit different. Some have facilities where they house the ambulance, more of a station base. Some are hospital-based, where the crew works in the emergency room or throughout the hospital once a call goes out, and at that point they become mobile. They also need to make sure that you staff trucks and staff the system based on what anticipated volume of calls you might encounter. And then is there any type of specific geographic and traffic considerations you have? Things like rush hour, things like construction. Generally, trains are another example. Now, those are pretty regular in their cadence and their timing, so they're more easily predictable than general traffic, or construction even for that matter. But we have to make sure that those are things that are going into the minds of us as we go onto the ambulance and into our operational management to make sure that we have supplies on the road and staffing on the road to carry out our mission. Now, deployment itself is generally based on past community responses. These are things like projected demographic changes, increase in call volume in the summertime versus in the fall. Maybe there's more traumatic injuries in the summer and less traumatic injuries in the fall. Maybe there's more respiratory issues in the winter. All of that past information is accumulated to help ensure optimal staffing based on the specific time and location of your ambulance service. We also know that that peak load, or the highest call volume you typically have, those are the times of day of week, times of day that we want to make sure we have adequate staffing. We don't want to have to rely on outside agencies or backup trucks or any of those components if we don't have to. Recognizing there's a shortage of providers and recognizing there's always methods underway for ensuring cost management, we have to provide the services to our community that we said we would. Primary areas of responsibility, also referred to as PARs, are basically where ambulances are in a system. We typically refer to that as system status here locally. It's deployment of ambulances where they sit and wait for calls based on specific high call volume locations. Most of the system status is not done anymore just by generic dispatchers as far as them choosing, but more so on a larger database and computerized system which predicts, based on past call volume and responses, where most likely an ambulance should be positioned to optimize response times, to reduce response times. I had an opportunity one time to be in the dispatch center in Life EMS in Grand Rapids, where their primary dispatch is. And they were explaining to me the idea of how system status worked, and one of the dispatchers actually moved a truck into a weird spot. The crew gave a little flack back on the radio. And as I watched that, within a matter of moments after that ambulance finally reached its destination for system status, a call dropped within 2 blocks of that ambulance. It just goes to show how accurate that computer system can be based on demographics and past call volume. We also know that PAR size, or the number of ambulances that are available and expect call volume. We don't want trucks on the road that are just going to sit there and do nothing all day. We want to make sure that we have adequate staffing, but not abundance of staffing if it's not necessary. Again, we talked about traffic congestion slightly. We talked about system status management, or SMS. Again, computerized deployment. We talked about it where it puts them into a location that's going to ensure appropriate response times and vehicle location. EMS response times can make a difference truly between life and death. Now, let's take that response times in general can save life and death, and take out the idea of emergency lights and sirens, because more than one study has shown that emergency lights and sirens are not an effective way of managing safe transport. And so because of that, system status is even more important than emergency lights and emergency vehicle operation, because it gets us closer to the call before the call drops, saving time, saving resources, and providing a safer route for transport. Response times of less than 4 minutes are always going to be associated with improved outcomes. Standard across the nation for response times is about 7 minutes. We know that response times throughout the nation have been increasing, again, because of the lack of staffing. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. And then the community needs to decide what response times are appropriate, and if they're dealing with some type of contract or agreement, or they're receiving a millage, maybe that needs to be incorporated into their standard practices. A tiered response system is important when we think about multiple agencies in a public safety response. As far as we want first responders to get there, because they can oftentimes reduce the time from dispatch to first personnel on scene, not necessarily the ALS ambulance, but at least a medical responder on scene. A first tier response is going to help ensure the arrival within a 4-minute window. Typically it's a fire or first responder volunteer service, or paid on call, or even full time for that matter. And then the second tier brings the ALS unit on within 8 minutes. Here we generally have a single response time where everybody gets or a single response system where everyone gets dispatched at once, and then response times naturally work themselves out. Some areas, like on the eastern portion of the state, will send a BLS unit first until they determine after patient contact if ALS is necessary. It's kind of an interesting system they run. When we also think about operational staffing, ambulance staffing should take into account peak loads of the system. We need to make sure that there's enough people on to cover the area and to cover the call volume. Some services have a variety of shift times to ensure coverage based on the busiest times of the day. So for example, you may have a car that starts at 5 and then at 6 and then at 7, then at 8, and then not one that comes in until like 7 at night. That may be, or 5 at night. That may be because those peak loads are necessary in the early morning or maybe in the early evening, but not so much in the middle of the day. It can be really anything, but kind of gives you an idea of how that would work. Services should take into account a reserve capacity. You have to be able to expect the unexpected to a certain extent when you're dealing with EMS. If you only have 4 trucks on all the time and there's a catastrophe that occurs, there's no reserve. Maybe that's a backup car or a call-out car. Maybe it's management staff, but there should be some type of backup plan or contingency plan in case there's a need to activate your reserve capacity. Each service needs to determine the standards for ambulance operation as far as the drivers themselves go, and for the driving vehicle itself. So the ambulance operational component, not only do we need to make sure we've got enough people in a reserve, but those people also have to be properly trained to be safe when operating an emergency vehicle. Now, education is important when it comes to ambulance operation, and unfortunately, we don't see enough education for emergency vehicle operation. Things that we want to recognize. Well, we want to be proactive in collision prevention programs. If we can avoid a collision before it occurs, we know we're going to reduce the cost, save more lives, and reduce the likelihood of injury. Again, one ambulance that gets involved in a crash takes an entire crew out of service, an entire ambulance out of service. Now, new equipment is necessary, there's insurance, and then even legal components as far as potentially lawsuits, civil or criminal lawsuits that can be taken on the providers, the ambulance services as well. So we have to kind of recognize that that's a huge component of operating an emergency vehicle safely, is make sure you train on it yearly. The state of Michigan requires each ambulance service to train on some type of vehicle operation annually. Does every service do that? Good question. We know that there's a marked increase in frequency of ground ambulance accidents over the past decade. There are more people just driving distracted than ever before. Things like this, your cell phone. That is a huge problem when it comes to identifying distracting a driver. We need to make sure that we recognize that people are more distracted now than ever, and they're not as worried about moving out of your way as you are getting to that call. We also know that modern automobiles are better sealed and more soundproof. They are not going to be able to hear your siren. They're not going to be able to hear your air horn. They're not going to be able to know that you're there, especially if they're in a more soundproof vehicle and they're distracted. Ambulances have an increased size and weight. They do not stop like a regular vehicle does. That weight continues to push them forward. That's their momentum that they have. They accelerate poorly because they're so heavy. They're less responsive than a normal vehicle, and they have much, much greater braking distance. You've got to remember, when you get that truck moving, and that truck may weigh anywhere between 15 to 20,000 pounds loaded up, if not more, you're going to have to give yourself an adequate amount of braking distance to be able to stop safely. Now remember, that's just driving normally, but if you've got someone in the back, you also have to be conscious about that. We have to recognize that the center of gravity is also different from an automobile. You can't turn or sharply, you will roll your vehicle. I've been on a number of ambulance rollovers from ambulance agencies that were not properly handling that emergency vehicle. And because of that, they turned too sharply and the vehicle turned over. One of the ways that I like to tell my EMTs or my partner to pay attention to how we're traveling down the road in the ambulance, and if I'm able to effectively work in the back, is to watch my IV bag. Typically, I'll hang my IV bag on the top of the ceiling on the IV pole, but I won't strap it in completely. And I do that intentionally because if my partner can look through the rearview mirror, maybe look through a video camera, whatever it might be, they can watch that IV swing. If that IV is swinging back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, you clearly can tell I'm not able to effectively work safely in that environment. And so it's a nice way for them to recognize if they're turning too sharp, if they're stopping too fast, things of that nature. We know that the majority of the collisions take place on clear days during daylight hours. There's no reason for that to happen. You would assume that it happens during fog or night or because of weather. That's not really the case. The largest number of ambulance collisions is where an ambulance strikes another vehicle laterally or at a right angle, or the ambulance is struck itself. These are almost always in an intersection. Nearly 3/4 of all accidents take place in intersections. So what are things that we can do to prevent these collisions and help our crews remain safe? Well, one thing is to treat every single lane of traffic, oncoming or you're the same direction as you're traveling, as a intersection. Stop, clear that lane, and then progress to the next one to stop, to look, to clear, to go through. It may take you a little bit more time, but those couple extra seconds are going to make a huge difference to your patient. If you get into an accident, that patient's going to have a delayed response, and that can mean the difference between life and death. How do we reduce ambulance collisions? Well, we know that they're less likely to occur if we can predict where they're likely to occur, and then either try to avoid that area or be more conscious of traveling through those things. Things again like intersections. Have a routine use of driver qualifications. So make sure that the driver is ready at the beginning of their shift and are properly trained on how to operate that emergency vehicle, and they maintain the proper driver license checks. Things like annual training or a closed cone course. They also need to be able to demonstrate the driver understands how to perform preventative maintenance to the vehicle. How do they know when the brakes sound funny? How do you know when a tire is low? How do you know what to do if you've got a problem with windshield wiper fluid, for example? Windshield's dirty, or you get a lot of dust, or it's a lot of slate and snow and the salt that's hitting your windshield. You need that to keep your visibility going. Make sure you're conscious of that. And it's always fun to give your new basic EMT that role to do, or your new partner. And if they're real new, you can tell them to go ahead and check the blinker fluid as well, because that's important for our emergency lights to blink. Provision of adequate hands-on training is important. Most places don't use enough training. They'll get you in the ambulance, they'll do your cone course. All right, great, out you go. Well, then you're operating a vehicle on a highway or in a roundabout or something crazy like that that you're not used to doing normally in that large a vehicle, and that's where error occurs. Simulation is a huge component. One of the things that I want you guys to do is to try to get time to come in and play around with our driving simulators if you haven't done so already. It gives you a great idea of braking distance, parking, backing, and you can do it all safely without worrying about crashing an ambulance. We also know that slow speed course to ensure, which is typically referred to as a closed course or cone course, really ensures that the driver knows how to operate the vehicle in tight locations, how to use their mirrors, back up, park, and then handle larger and smaller size vehicles. Training that ensures operators know how to react in an emergency situation is key. We make sure that we train in how to respond to pediatrics and how to respond in a cardiac arrest, but we don't, again, train enough on how we respond in emergency avoidance collision. Drivers must have the knowledge of primary and backup routes to all the hospital areas that there's in their service area, or at least have the ability to figure out how to get to a specific hospital if they don't know. GPS is a great component. Punch in the information to make sure you get there. Do know this, so that GPS is oftentimes not the most fast or most direct route. And if your patient is aware, awake, and alert, they may notice that. Again, make sure you have a good understanding of your department rules, regulation, laws, all of that's already previously established. Now, we again talked about procedures for qualifying for an ambulance driver. We've talked about the proper handling of the vehicle, but we also have to talk about the reporting of what happens if an ambulance is involved in a collision. It's going to be more of a unique process to that agency, but you want to know, what are you supposed to do if you accidentally bump into someone or you slide into another vehicle on an icy day? What do you do? What's the operational component to get your truck back in service, to replace that vehicle? Do you contact a supervisor? How do you document that? All those components. A couple standard operating procedures that you should make sure are implemented when you're on your truck, even if your company does not. One of those is a method for using spotters when backing up a vehicle. Most collisions can occur not only in intersections, but then right after that, it's from backing up into things. Recognize that there should be a spotter of some sort in those components. Using of seatbelts, using proper seatbelts not only for the driver, but also for the patient care provider in the back and the patient. And children, what do we do for transporting multiple patients? Anyone over the under the weight of 40 pounds should be in a child safety restraint device. And then again, what constitutes an emergency response? We know that truly it's only a matter of seconds that are saved when we respond to emergency lights and sirens, transporting or responding to a call. Is that really necessary? And is there anything else that we can implement that will help us remain safer? And then know that Michigan does have laws that will ticket someone for not yielding to an emergency vehicle, but regardless, at the moment of an emergency response, you're requesting the right of way to transport or to move past that vehicle. Guidelines on prudent speed. We always use the term due regard, which is very generic. Generally, you're allowed to go faster than the posted speed limit, against traffic, park where you need to, those different types of components. But due regard is important when it comes to how you operate your vehicle. You are going to be held to a higher standard than anyone else when it comes to operating your emergency vehicle. If your lights are on and you're in an accident, you'll be deemed at fault until proven otherwise. We know that circumstances and procedures for the use of an escort is highly not recommended, solely because it's more likely that an intersection collision will occur. And then you cannot ever operate an emergency vehicle if you're under the influence of alcohol, drugs, or any other mind-altering substances. We talked about the due regard standard. It's a standard that exempts ambulance operators, we'll say instead of drivers, from certain laws, but again holds them to a higher level of standard. Now, state laws typically exempt you from having requirements on how to operate your emergency vehicle. Again, we talked about these: speed limit, direction of travel, parking, and then what do you have to do if it comes to waiting at a red light. Now, ambulances rarely or never exempt from passing things like railroad guards, gates that come down, or school buses. If you're caught by a train, you're caught by a train. Shut your lights off and wait. If you're caught by a bus, shut your lights off and wait. Last thing you need to do is cause someone else to get confused while a child is exiting a school bus and either get hit by your vehicle or another vehicle in the area as they are not sure what to do. So again, if those are situations, turn your lights off and wait. It's going to be okay. Just let dispatch know if there's any type of prolonged delay. And you should be able to anticipate railroad crossings because again, trains literally run like clockwork. So you should have an idea of where you should be, your direction of travel or your navigation path to get to the call, and try to avoid those locations if you can. Again, the responsibility for deciding when and where exemptions apply for the driver is completely up to you. You will always be held to the higher standard than any other driver, and you must be prepared to shoulder that responsibility that comes with the profession that you've chosen. Lights and sirens do give you a false sense of security. Don't rely on lights and sirens to alert motorists of your approach, right? That's not going to be enough. If you can, try to make eye contact with folks and give them time to react. It's important for your safety, because if you can't make it to that call, an ambulance is going to be delayed even longer to get there, and then there's other injuries that you have caused while trying to treat another. Many motorists feel that the right-of-way privileges given to ambulance are abused when the siren is sounded. People also sometimes don't think that they need to yield to you. Remember, regardless of the situation, you are requesting the right-of-way, and that you are using your siren appropriately to clear traffic in a safe and reasonable fashion. Inexperienced drivers tend to go faster than they should. Turn the siren on, automatically they're going to go 10 to 15 miles over the posted speed limit. That is not necessary. You may need to go less than the posted speed limit, for example, on the highway if it's icy or excessively rainy, or maybe you've got leaves that have fallen down into the ground and it's just some dew. That will create a lot of slippery problems with traction. So recognize that just operating your lights don't mean you have to drive like you've stole the vehicle. Keep that in mind. You also should have continuous sound of the siren, right? That's playing while you transport. You should change your siren within 100 feet or so of the intersection, from a wail to a yelp or vice versa. You don't want to excessively use your air horn or excessively switch your siren. It makes it harder for those frequencies to travel and people to be able to hear that change in sound. And again, remember, that constant siren sound isn't good for you. You may know in class where I keep going, pardon me, excuse me, what was that? That's because I spent so long in an ambulance with sirens running all the time, and every call was an emergency response when I got started, and it does play a toll on your ability to hear. Again, we talked about this as far as getting anxiety and other components in any type of long run. Use your siren sparingly, only when you must, and never ever assume that motorists hear the siren itself. Assume that the motorist will hear the siren but choose to ignore it. Be prepared for panic drivers, erratic maneuvers, where they either hear it or they don't hear the siren. And never ever use the siren to scare someone. Maybe other than your partner once. Wherever an ambulance on the road, day or night, the headlights need to be on. Turn your headlights on always. Some come on automatically, some don't. Your vehicle typically is going to remain running the entire time you're in it, or the entire time that you're working your shift. Having your headlights on increases your visibility significantly. It's just a good habit even in your own personal vehicle. Eventually, it just becomes a habit. We want to make sure that they have large enough flashers that they blink in tandem or in unison, which is going to help oncoming vehicles identify the location and size of the ambulance, especially as it's approaching. We know that its most important point is visibility, right? So we want to make sure that all emergency lights have the ability to be seen from a 360-degree viewpoint for motorists and pedestrians, and that we must ensure benefits afforded by the patient for lights and sirens are not offset by the risks to the crews or the public. Remember, just because we can doesn't mean we should. Safety has to be at the forefront of everything we do in EMS. We talked about escorts and multiple vehicle response. The more vehicles you have responding to one location increases the risk for collision, again, at intersections. Police escorts are no longer suggested because one vehicle will clear the intersection, traffic starts to move. They don't realize another one is coming behind it, followed by another, followed by another. If they have to have it, you need to make sure that you have the intersections blocked off by police completely while you travel through, and you should still clear those intersections. Each lane of traffic is an intersection as you move through. Again, keep your head on a swivel. And then recognize that police cars and ambulances are very different in weight and acceleration and braking. They just don't have the same response. Motorists are not likely to realize that other emergency vehicles are traveling together, like we talked about. Again, it makes it more dramatic for the likelihood of intersection collisions occurring. So negotiate intersections assuming that you're going to meet another emergency vehicle, especially if you are responding with multiple agencies, multiple services, maybe it's first responders, fire base, maybe a medical control response vehicles as well. Be aware that intersections are the most dangerous component. Last thing we want to do is hit another oncoming vehicle. I've got some videos that I'll show you as we go through your lesson. Parking and loading the ambulance, think about where you're going to be when you have to park and load your ambulance. Don't block yourselves in. Think ahead. Establish yourself a danger zone at least 100 feet from wreckage, upwind, uphill, to avoid any type of fire or escaping hazardous liquids or fumes. Again, the safety is of the utmost important for you, your partner, and your patients. If no fire or escaping liquids or fumes are there, you can get within 50 feet, and that's probably a really appropriate place to park. If possible, get someone that's going to help control traffic until the police arrive. Again, that's going to help control the risk. And park in front of the wreckage so that the warning lights can be seen when it comes to oncoming approaching motorists. Here's an example of what we look at here. If we take a look at our top video here, let me pull my laser pointer out here. Here we're looking up here at the top. You can see that on arrival, you've already got police that are there. They get cones or flares out. You can move to the front of that vehicle. Give yourself 100 feet, right? Especially if we're dealing with any type of hazards. And that way we can get our patients out. We can move them where we need to, and we can transport forward. If your unit's the first on scene, you're going to give yourself some type of blockage. Your emergency lights will be active, so you can protect yourself from the scene. Again, 100 feet. Utilize warning lights and maximize your braking ability in case you come into someone rear ends the ambulance and protects you by activating your emergency brake. Also activates the high idle on most vehicles. And make sure your lights are on so that you illuminate the scene as much as possible. We also want to make sure that we have proper access points to our patient, and that our safety, again, is considered important, right? So the rear ambulance doors, when they're open, most of the time we keep them open, they can obstruct your emergency lights. Most ambulances will have pancake lights that will show through the back windows of the ambulance when the doors are open, but if there's any type of covering to them to provide more privacy to the patient, it's going to be hard for those to be seen. Make sure that there's other lights or a light bar, a strip on the back, something that would allow for more visibility. Remember that red lights bring on more attention, right? The old rubbernecker is the primary way we look at it, right? Red lights make people bend to look at the accident, causing another one. So if we don't need to activate them, turn them off. More tired drivers and drunk drivers will drive right into red lights than anything else. We also need to know that turning off things like headlights, deactivating your white lights, or even shutting off your emergency lights if not necessary, all will help provide better visibility on scene and less distracted drivers. The more lights, the more lookers. We also know that amber lights are the most visible lights to drivers, which is interesting that we allow tow truck drivers to do that, but not necessarily emergency vehicles. Emergency vehicles have to have yellow lights on the back. A lot of them are using rotator single lights on the top now, or some type of LED strip light or pancake light. Again, stop at all red lights, stop at all stop signs, clear the intersection, then travel through. Even if it's a green light, I still stop, or at least slow the vehicle down drastically to clear each intersection. Make eye contact with motorists when they're possible, because that ensures they've seen you, you've seen them, and they're aware that you're there. There is a lot of issues when it comes to the deadly intersection. If using exemptions offered to you as an emergency vehicle operator, you must make sure that you warn motorists by flashing your lights and sounding the siren at intersections. You need to. It's going to keep you safe and keep them. Remember that lights and siren are only asking for the public to move the right of way. Never assume that motorists know what your plans are or what you plan on doing at an intersection. Even if you have your turn signals on, there's too many lights flashing on that ambulance for them to know what's going on. If possible, use your signals, but recognize that you should always go around cars that are stopped on the left hand or on the driver's side. If the motorist is doing what they should do, they should pull to the right to allow for you more room to pass. But not everyone does that. Know how long it takes for your ambulance to cross intersections. Watch pedestrians. Make sure you don't have anyone popping out at you. Make sure that you're also remembering there's no such thing as a rolling stop in an ambulance that weighs more than 10,000 or even as high of 24,000 pounds loaded down. You must come to a complete stop, clear this intersection, progress through, clearing lane by lane by lane, and then go and continue on at that point. Remember, you just can't stop that vehicle. Even if you want to, you can still cause a lot of harm if you think you're in control and that you're not. In summary, you've learned about an ambulance operation primarily throughout your EMT training and your everyday experience while operating an emergency vehicle. We know that good safety habits grow stronger with review and practice, so review and practice regularly. Be familiar with the standards that influence ambulance design, equipment requirements, and staffing, and give your ideas to management. Share your ideas for improving safety and reducing risks or hazards. Remember these four primary components. 1, regularly complete checklists, whether they apply to the vehicle, onboard equipment, or any other essential supplies. 2, be aware of items that require routine maintenance or calibration, as well as expiration dates on equipment and all drugs. Keep in mind of all the OSHA requirements that promote safety for you and your patients. And 4, know how to report equipment problems or failures to your supervisor, and do that early so that way you can replace that equipment and remain in service. Ambulance operators have special responsibilities whenever they take the wheel. Professionalism and professional duty to recognize the profile of typical ambulance collisions and how you can develop strategies to prevent them from occurring is critical. Think about how you operate the vehicle, just as you think about how you intubate a patient or how you deal with a pediatric medication administration. Remember, it's more than just operating the vehicle. It's safely transporting your patients. Be aware of issues surrounding staging and staffing of ambulances, especially right now. Now is a difficult time with such a drastic shortage in paramedics and EMS providers across the nation. And make sure that you have the ability to determine your agency's policies in all of these matters. Share your ideas and thoughts, practice best standards and practices, and make sure you remain safe. I hope that you guys have got a lot out of this lesson as we talked about ground ambulance operation. Remember, most of this material is going to be reviewed for you from your basic EMT component and your vehicle driver's training. With that, I will catch you guys on the next lesson.